Hello, everyone. This is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of 55 plus training sessions that will help you and your team avoid fraud, compliance fines, and bad vendor data. Or just sign up to get access to vendor process FAQs and to attend weekly drop-in live Q&A sessions. Visit training.deborahrrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. So I have an update to a topic that I originally wrote about in 2019 before the C word, and then I updated it with podcast episode 145, and that was in the summer of 2021, like right in the middle of the C word, or maybe even the P word. But anyway, now in 2023, there is at least one new threat that is gaining traction. So keep listening. Welcome to episode 231. Is your accounts payable team still taking phone calls from vendors? Updated for 2023. Now, I've said this in the blog post from 2019, from 2021. I don't think I did anything in 2020, but the 2021 blog post and podcast episode 145 had this in it about the human voice and about it being the oldest and most effective interaction, and how it's being used by fraudsters to solicit sensitive information via live phone calls. The social engineering tactic is sometimes called vishing. Actually, it is called vishing, and more people are aware of that now. And that is where emotional triggers, a sense of urgency, right, are used to play on human vulnerabilities. And now we are adding in evolving technologies, including artificial intelligence. So combine all of that with the weakest link in any security system, that is you and your team members or whomever is on the accounts payable or vendor customer service desk or help desk, and really a basis for eliminating those live phone calls can be made. All right, so let's start off with the rise of scams. The rise of scams with the pandemic in 2020 increased fraud in accounts payable and the vendor team, as with most functions. And the phones are being targeted, really. I posted a new scam alert back in 2020 from both the FBI, right, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, or CISA, CISA, I think that's how they say it. Anyway, they warned against an increase of vishing, right, the phone phishing, since the start of companies working from home. So when everyone abruptly went home, the fraudsters increased their vishing. Actually, they increased all fraud, but vishing too. And they found that in the middle July or mid-July of 2020, a vishing campaign was reported that targeted employees' VPN credentials and even spoofed phone numbers of colleagues and other employees at these companies to appear legitimate. And so when I say in the title, still taking phone calls from vendors, I actually mean from employees too, or could be from employees too, because they can get spoofed just like your vendors can. And they don't always call in from the company phone system. They can call in from a cell phone. And this happened a lot back in back in 2020, especially if they couldn't get up and running on the phone system at home, and many could not. And so Fraudster saw their chance and they took it. And then in 2021, I posted a new scam alert where the SC magazine posted about how cyber criminals were using a combination of email, and that's phishing, and phone or vishing. So they were using a combination of both, a two-pronged attack on businesses. So they would send an email and then follow up that email with a phone call. And the premise was that the hybrid or doing both actually made them appear more legitimate. And I have to say, I'm wondering if they got that from the same advice that business owners received when they targeted B2B, right, businesses like your company, about how to sell them stuff. And one of the pieces of advice was to send an email and then immediately follow up with a phone call to say you sent an email. And so Fraudsters, right, they have access to the same thing. I don't know if they paid for the class, attended the class, but they took the same advice. But in any event, so that happened. And then in 2022, I posted a vendor master file tip of the week video, which I've been doing since I think it was October of 2021. Every Tuesday, I post a tip on YouTube. So if you don't follow my channel, if you don't know about it, check the show notes. I'll have a link to it in the description. But in any event, I posted a video. And again, this was in June 2022, but it was after a post in that month from the FBI about business identity compromise, which detailed how deep fake technology is being used in scams. Now, at that point, they said that especially if you were doing video, you could tell by, some of the movements with their lips and their body movements that it was a fake, right? Deep fake. But this is, again, in 2023. And we've seen the improvement with ChatGPT 4. And not just that, but I watched a video yesterday and it talked about how ChatGPT was just the tip of the iceberg. There is a site out there called futuretools.io, and you can go to that site and you can find many, many hundreds of platforms or products that use AI. And if you go on there and you search for voice, it's going to be pretty disturbing because you're going to find a lot. And some of those technologies will allow you to upload a video and then use the voice from that video in whatever text you come up with. And that's the update for 2023, that AI technology out there where you, and again, a fraudster, can use an existing video to get you or your vendors or your team members' voice and then create new audio using that same voice. So again, sounds like taking telephone calls, especially to discuss payment information and other sensitive information, is really risky. But not only that, what's the alternative? If you don't have a vendor self-registration portal or any type of a vendor portal where you can communicate back and forth with your vendor where they can initiate messages that's outside of just talking about a specific invoice. If you have something like that, I would recommend that you definitely take the communication from your vendors out of email, out of phone calls, and put it into or require the vendors to register so that they can communicate with you inside of a portal or platform that requires them to sign in. Now, that's not foolproof. There is no silver bullet, right? Because they can get social engineered, meaning the vendors can get social engineered just like anyone, and they can get their login credentials stolen, and they can allow then the fraudsters, give them the information that they need to sign into those portals and then communicate with you. That has happened, but it's happened much less than the fraud that has occurred from taking phone calls and communicating with vendors via email when you do not have any processes in place. And so we'll talk about what those processes are. But sounds like both telephone calls and email, communicating with or using that to communicate what could be sensitive information is risky. And so the question of, is your accounts payable team still taking phone calls from vendors? And that's now brought into phone calls or emails. And vendors have brought into vendors or employees. If that's still a question, and if you are still doing that, there are some things that you can do to protect yourself and your company, as well as your vendor and your employee as well. So you're protecting quite a few different roles in this process. So if that's still your question and you are still doing it, the answer is yes. Let's talk about some techniques that you can use to avoid fraud in that process. So what I call it is techniques to authenticate callers and keep your vendor's data safe. And again, this is if you do not have a way to eliminate the phone calls, eliminate the email inquiries for vendor requests, be it the vendor or the internal team member. If you do not have a separate platform that will allow them to log in and communicate with you, then you have no choice but to either take the phone call and or the email, respond to the email. So let's talk about techniques to authenticate callers and really emailers or requesters as well, and keep your vendor's data safe. So the first thing is you need to authenticate each external call, vendor, and employee before discussing any vendor invoice or account information, or even instructions on how to update their information. And so when you think about this, think about when you contact your bank, and I always use bank. If you guys have been listening to me or listen to any of my podcasts on collection of bank details, I always talk about authentication and following what the bank does. But nowadays, I call my cable company and they are asking me identifying information. So when you call someone to talk about your account, a business to talk about your account, more than likely they will require you to identify or to answer 2 to 3 identifying questions. And so you need to require that of whoever you're talking to. And so require at least 2 pieces of information that a fraudster hopefully would not know. But I do understand that they can get into the vendor's real email and even into your internal employee's real email, and they can sift through and find some of that information. So we'll talk about how to develop that template or reference so that you can be a little more random. But in any event, you want to ask 2 pieces of information that a fraudster would not know, such as an invoice number and a PO number. And for the employee, you can require that they provide like 2 pieces of information, such as the cubicle number or maybe even their next level up, anything that would be available on like your company intranet. I've had some clients would include like their employee ID. That's something you don't typically find in an email or in, at least I don't think so, in an email exchange that a fraudster would have privy to if they were able to take over their account with valid login credentials. But that's up to you to create that. And again, we'll talk about that in a minute. But another thing too is social engineer or social-engineer.org. They say you can try this tactic when you're on the phone with the vendor. So in addition to that authentication with the 2 to 3 pieces of information, identifying information, you can ask the fraudster like for their name, their company, their phone number, or just put them on hold, and the fraudster will just disconnect. So if the help desk member or you or your team member is uncomfortable in any way, they can take that caller's information and then tell them someone will call them back. And if they actually give identifying information, it can be validated or handed over to leadership and or the security team. So you can ask them, specific information about their company, them and their company, or put them on hold, or just try to take a message. When has anyone taken a message nowadays? But just try to take a message. Either of those, and the fraudster will probably just go away and focus on another potential victim that's not doing all of that. Now, the second thing is I talked about the reference that for the identifying questions that the accounts payable team or help desk or customer service desk can use. And so give them a reference for that authentication. And the reference really makes it easier to remember what information can be used to authenticate the caller or the emailer. And it is helpful if different combinations of elements can be used to authenticate. So I have a authentication reference template that I use, and it has multiple columns, and it has identifying information in a separate column for the invoice, identifying information in a separate column for the PO, and then also for the vendor master file, information in the vendor master file. And so that way they can use different combinations and not just, 2 pieces of identifying information from the same column. So it's not helpful to ask for an invoice number and an invoice date, because Fraudster can get a hold of an invoice and then authenticate. You want to ask it from different columns. And I've also worked with teams or clients that have had vendor self-registration portals, right? Because not all of them don't have all the bells and whistles. So you still need to make sure that you're making up for that. And this one happened to not have an adequate messaging feature. And so what we did is we had another column for the vendor portal, and we added information or pieces of data from the portal that they could use. Like there was a vendor ID that was created specifically for the portal, and it was also a unique invitation number that was used or added to the emails when the internal team member sent an invitation to the vendor to register. So if for example, the vendor couldn't register or had issues registering, when they contacted the help desk, the client wanted to make sure that they had a way for these new vendors to authenticate, because they wouldn't have like any invoices or POs. They might have a contract, but they wouldn't have any invoices or POs. And so you can do that. Keep that in mind. You can do that as well. And so make sure you have that reference. It will increase the potential too that the team members will comply with the policy, because it'll make it easier for them to do that. And don't forget to include a short script that they can use to explain the reason for the authentication, and also include in the script how to end the call when the authentication is not successful. They have to have a way to gracefully exit. And also keep in mind that this reference should be treated as confidential and not shared with anyone outside of the accounts payable team, the vendor team, the customer, whatever team is using it. That's the only team that should know what is included. Now, you can create one in this free, no-cost training session. So I have about 45 or 46 different training sessions on vendor process on the Vendor Process Training Center. And I made the decision in 2023, as of January 1, to make this training session free, because I think it's very important to make sure that the accounts payable team or the vendor team or whatever team is taking these calls and emails, to make sure that they know that they are talking with or communicating with their vendor or their internal team member and not a fraudster. I think it's very critical. So the training session is called Build an Authentication Matrix. So your vendor team and help desk do not communicate with a fraudster. And yes, I do get the prize for the longest titles ever. I always have very long titles, but I will have a link to that training session in the show notes. So make sure that you click on that, and any team members that you think would benefit from it, if they are answering or responding to inquiries via email or via phone. So make sure you do that. Now, the next thing is to make sure that you limit the information revealed. So also on that reference template, and by the way, I didn't say it, but in that training session, that no cost or free training session, you do get an actual template for that authentication reference. And what's meant to do during the training session is that we review it and you can start populating it so you can ask any questions throughout the training. But two of the columns on there, outside of the identifying questions, like by function in the separate columns. One is information that you can provide, and then the other is information that you can only confirm. So you need to identify that. I do have some example data that I've used for other clients to start you off, and you can get rid of them. You can add more. You can do whatever you need to do to it, but you need to identify what information they can give away or reveal, and what information they can only confirm. And so an example of that would be, since many of the inquiries to the help desk is, when is my payment due, right? So you can identify the payment date and the payment amount, but if you need to give them a listing of the invoices that were paid, my recommendation is that you go back to the vendor master file, get the email address that's on file and remittance email address that is on file, and then send the list of invoices that payment included, or that payment paid, and then you can send that via email. So that's one. And then the other is making sure you have identified what data can only be confirmed. And an example of that would be the bank account number. So they might call and say they missed a payment. And you say, well, it was sent, and they'll ask you, well, what bank account number did you send it to? And you can ask them what bank account number is on file and have them confirm it. And you only need the last 4 digits. You don't need to have them give you the full bank account number. But again, only confirm, do not give out that information. And that's, again, even after they have authenticated themselves, because you still do not want to have what is considered sensitive personal information given away. And you definitely also do not want them to verbally say the entire, let's say in this case, bank account number, because you never know where they are either, right? People nowadays, you don't know if they're working in the office, working from home, traveling. And so just make sure that where necessary or where available, you're only asking for the last 4 digits of that number. So you can do it for the bank account number. You can also do it for like the tax ID. All right, so limiting information revealed. And then the last thing that you can do is to send the vendor a confirmation. And what I mean by that is, if the phone call or the email was requesting instructions of how to update anything in the vendor master file, and I shouldn't say anything, It can be anything that is sensitive related to payments, like their bank account number or their remittance address if they have a check payment method. Then if any of that information was updated, you can send a confirmation email to the vendor. Now, this is the same thing as or if you updated your Netflix account, your Amazon account, your Walgreens account, any online account that you update, you're going to get an email. And some of them will also send a snail mail. They'll send it to the mail through the mail as well. And that's a notification to let you know something has changed. And if you did not initiate that change, then they have instructions for what you should do next, either changing your password or contacting them. And you can do the same thing for your vendors as well. So if somehow the vendor got through the authentication or the fraudster got through the authentication, was able to send a change in, let's say, banking, and I'll use banking because of the recent Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank failures, and we might have a lot of activity with bank changes. But if they were able to get that far and there was a change in the banking and you sent an email to the vendor to let them know that their information was changed. And I know we can have a lot of jokes about vendors reading their emails, but if you contacted the vendor after the change was made and they did not initiate the change, then they can hopefully contact you in time before you even pull that payment into the pay cycle. And I also mean, even if they got through not just the authentication and the update, but the confirmation call. And let me just say about that confirmation call, it's not a silver bullet either, because there have been confirmation calls made. I had a few clients last year that made confirmation calls, at least they thought that their team was making confirmation calls, and they ended up making fraudulent payments anyway. And so that's not a silver bullet. So you have to have layers, and sending that vendor confirmation is another layer. Now, with this one, when I was a practitioner, we did it and we were able to trigger it automatically from one of our accounting systems or ERPs, but not all of them. Some of them we had to do it manually, meaning we had to create the email and we had to send it to the remittance email address on file. And if there was no email on file, which I know a lot of you had this problem, we had to send it by snail mail. And that's why I brought up the fact that snail mail is still being used by some companies in addition to sending by email. But in any event, send that vendor the confirmation, and that's one more layer of security or confirmation that you can use in addition to anything else that you are using now. All right, so those are some techniques to authenticate callers, emailers, and then keep your vendors' data safe. But you also need to make sure that both you and your team are staying up to date with fraud trends, with new scam alerts, because they are just happening. They are evolving quickly. Fraudsters tend to do that. So if you want monthly training for your vendor team that includes new frauds and how to combat them, then sign up for this monthly training that I have, or training session that I have. It's called Frauds and New Scam Alerts, plus how to prevent them. And really, it's part of the training sessions that I do on the Vendor Process Training Center. It's just that on the last Thursday of every month, that weekly training is on frauds and new scam alerts and how to prevent them. And starting 2023, I didn't make it free like I made the authentication training session, but I did make it so that if you pay for 1 month, which is $49, one training session, that pays for each of your months for the entire year. So if you pay for, if you start off now and tomorrow, is the next one, or the last Thursday of any month, then you will be able to watch your recordings back monthly from 2022, January 2022 through the current month. And then you can sign up for the future months through December 2023. So make sure you check that out. And you can even have like one person in your group sign up for it. And then in your vendor master file, or vendor process, or vendor team meetings, I should say, have that as an agenda item, and then have that person come back and report what they have learned. That is, I guess, most applicable to your company and your processes. All right, so that's it for today. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 231st episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.